In the town of Rimouski, in the Canadian province of Quebec, there is a graveyard and a memorial. It commemorates a maritime disaster that happened less than 5 miles away on the St. Lawrence River in May of 1914, 2 years after the Titanic went down. Within sight of land, an ocean liner sank. 1,012 people lost their lives, including 159 children. But the story of who they were and how they died is almost unknown. Even the man who found the Titanic had never heard of a ship called the Empress of Ireland.
Well, over the last 15 years, I've traveled literally all over the world, visiting the great liners that didn't make it. But I'd never gone to the Empress of Ireland. In fact, quite honestly, I didn't know it existed. In fact, I was embarrassed when someone pointed out to me that the Empress of Ireland actually had more passengers die on it than the Titanic, and it was odd, you know, why did no one ever hear of the Empress of Ireland?
For Bob Ballard, there are always questions to be asked, and the answers can sometimes be found in that mysterious underwater realm that has fascinated Ballard since he was a boy.
Well, as far back as I can remember, I wanted to be an undersea explorer. I wanted to be Captain Nemo. And fortunately, people didn't laugh when I said that. I was always wondering what was under the ocean. I always wanted to stick my head underwater. I think from the moment I could hold my breath, I did just that, stuck my head and went underwater.
Bob Ballard has spent the last 20 years of his life exploring the ships that have perished at sea. Each one is a little piece of history, preserved in a place that is unimaginably difficult to reach.
The deep sea is a preserver of history. It's a giant museum. Things that fall to the deep sea sort of go into a state of suspended animation. All of a sudden I realized these ships are in a very high state of preservation, and that sort of caused me to want to see more of them, want to see all of them.
In the years since he located the wreck of the Titanic, Ballard has traveled to all of history's famous lost liners, except one. This visit will be his last.
Clearly, before I could end this journey and hopefully move on to some other phase in my life, I had to come to the Empress of Ireland.
The rest of the world paid little attention when the Empress of Ireland went down. But Canadians have been haunted by the sinking for generations.
The spectacle of sea disaster, of a great ship plummeting to the depths, it's possible to forget the human element, the individuals who died, sometimes horribly, in these circumstances. Each of them had a very special life of their own. There's so much to learn from a shipwreck. It's not just a kind of spectacle, a horror story. There's more to it than that. There are lives that were radically changed.
Here, on the St. Lawrence River, where David Creighton's grandparents lost their lives, Ballard has invited Creighton to visit the ship that changed his family's history.
In a disaster like that, where so many people are affected, I mean, losing their lives, that it's passed on and it multiplies. So you take over 1,000 people, and then their families, and so by the time you get to the present, there are thousands and thousands of people that were affected by that, and carry it with them to this day. You want to go out?
A four-man dive team with a camera will be Ballard's and Creighton's eyes underwater.
Okay.
It should take about 2 days to photograph the Empress from bow to stern, if the seas remain calm.
Today's a gorgeous day. It's just beautiful. And you forget that when the disaster took place, it wasn't like this at all. It was windy and cold and dark, and that this is a very sad place. And yet it's such a gorgeous day today. You have to remember what's beneath us right now. It's still a grave.
There are a lot of graves in this part of the world.
The North Atlantic has a distinction of being the most dangerous ocean in the world. It's the foggiest, the iciest, the stormiest, it's even the saltiest. It could be an unconscionably unkind ocean. And it didn't matter if it was winter or summer, it was an unpredictably uncomfortable ride. Most people hated to cross.
The very first immigrants came to America in sailing ships, a journey that could take up to a month.
And it was perilous. I mean, people died on those trips. People were certainly miserable for most of the trip. Seasick, being thrown around like a little cork in a washing machine. You really had to want to make the trip.
But with the introduction of steam power, things began to change. Wooden hulls and masts disappeared, replaced by iron and steel. That meant you could make bigger ships for the growing immigrant trade. In American factories, immigrant labor had produced an explosion of wealth and a few very rich men who understood the power of the new technologies. With the right kinds of machines, nature itself might be mastered. Immigrants from Europe streamed into America to run the new machines, and there was money to be made taking them across the ocean, in ships that were bigger and faster than anything that had gone before.
We were able to make ships of steel. All of a sudden the ships could be much, much larger. And money was in volume. And so they made them as big as they could and put as many people in them as they could. It was simple math. Make them big, fill them with people, and make them as fast as you can so you can do it again and again and again.
The ocean liners wanted the immigrants because they were the most profitable passengers. They took up less space and required less service, could be fed indifferently. It didn't matter what they just survived the crossing. And they were used to not very distinguished surroundings, so it didn't matter to them. They were anxious to get to America. So the companies built ships that were large enough to accommodate in their lower hulls, packed with immigrants. And we always remember the elegance and the luxury on the upper decks of these ocean liners, but what really counted for the companies was the warrens of steerage compartments or third-class cabins below the waterline.
You had people from really all walks of life in third class. You had people who came from maybe ordinary families and were just traveling as cheaply as possible, but you also had people who came from homes that had no floors, had dirt floors and grass roofs or whatever. And so for these people to suddenly have, running water and electricity and electric lights and all the food they could eat, and they didn't have to work for it, and they got to have a vacation for 7 days at sea. They didn't have to do anything, and they'd never had that before in their lives, and this was wonderful. So even third class had it far better than they did on shore. They loved it.
And it's an interesting thing that the posters advertising steamship service across the Atlantic never said America. They said New York. New York was the cynosure of freedom. New York and the Statue of Liberty was what really was the objective, that these millions of huddled masses, as Emma Lazarus has so aptly christened them, crossed the Atlantic, the sea. The arrival in the port of New York, these huge ocean liners, with their decks packed with immigrants, would all be crowded at the portside railings to see the Statue of Liberty. The ships would literally list to port as the vessels came in. And that enormous hegira of passengers wanting to cross to the New World was what made the Atlantic liners so big. They were far bigger than liners on any other ocean.
Like any commercial enterprise, the moving of people across the Atlantic in ships was a competitive sport. And for many, many years, the Germans held what was called the Blue Ribbon, which meant that they were the fastest ship. They were the Greyhound. So each company would try to build a ship that could go faster than the last one, faster than the last one. And it became a sense of pride as well, and it became a sense of national pride.
And for 10 years, from 1897 to 1907, you could say it was a German decade on the North Atlantic. The Kaiser Wilhelm der Große, for instance, or the Deutschland, these incredibly fast ships, held the Blue Ribbon and attracted the best passenger traffic there was. Cunard couldn't stand the thought of this, that they didn't have the Blue Ribbon.
So Great Britain's Cunard Line decided to build a pair of ships that could make the trip in under 5 days. They would be revolutionary in design, at once the biggest and the fastest ships in the world. One would be called Mauretania. Lusitania would be her sister.
It would be the technological wonder of its age. It would be the ship of the future. And the specifications on it were absolutely enormous. Everything was oversized, overspeeded. The Lusitania's engines at 68,000 horsepower were 75% bigger than any known engine of the time.
Construction on the twin started in 1904. No ship this large had ever been attempted, but in an era filled with optimism about the potential of technology, few doubted that it could be done. In 2 separate shipyards, one in England, one in Scotland, the radical new designs were forged in iron and steel. Lusitania was the first ship to use 4 propellers. She had 25 boilers, twice the number of her German counterparts, and her hull was double-skinned in case she needed to see service as a warship.
The Lusitania was on a 3-month track ahead of Mauretania, so she was launched first. It was to her went the honor of that terrible launch for the first time of a 16,000-ton hull. Nobody had ever done it before.
But the engineers had done their homework. The largest ship ever built was launched without mishap. And a year later, she was ready for her trial runs. In the open sea, she made an astonishing 25.5 knots, but vibrated badly. She was pulled into dry dock, where her hull was strengthened. Then it was time to furnish her. If the ship's designers looked to the future in planning the machinery that powered her, Lusitania's decorators took their inspiration from the past. Her public rooms were based on the simple, delicate lines of the Georgian period and featured white plaster highlighted by gold leaf. Walls were paneled in highly polished mahogany and walnut. Floors were covered with luxurious rose-colored carpets. Chairs and sofas were upholstered in silk. Her music room had vaulted ceilings with 12 stained glass panels, each one symbolizing a month of the year. Finally, in the fall of 1907, it was time for Lusitania's maiden voyage. On that first trip, she fell 30 minutes short of the German record. But on her second crossing, Lusitania beat the record by about 4 hours. The blue ribbon was back in British hands.
And the Mauretania came in November and beat the Lusitania. And for the next few years, the 2 ships, Lusitania and Mauretania, would shave perhaps a few minutes off each other's crossing time. It didn't matter. Cunard had the blue ribbon, and whether it was Lusitania or Mauretania didn't matter. What mattered was that the German threat had been bested.
The Cunard liners were also as profitable as they were swift, a fact that didn't escape the attention of American financier J.P. Morgan, who held a majority interest in Cunard's chief British rival, the White Star Line. Morgan's railroads carried immigrants across America. Now he wanted a piece of the lucrative transatlantic trade, and he thought he had the right formula to make it happen.
White Star decided that they would have to build ships to counter Cunard's lead, not faster ships, but bigger ships and better ships, better in terms of comfort, deluxe instead of dispatch. And it was their idea to make their ships so comfortable that passengers wouldn't mind the additional day at sea.
The White Star Line thought, well, we can get them fairly quickly, not absolutely as fast as Cunard, but let's do it in a nice way. Let's get them there in the lap of luxury. Let's provide greater amenities and do the equivalent of a 5-star hotel at sea.
And so, side by side in a shipyard in Northern Ireland, the largest moving objects in the history of the world began to take shape. Rivet by rivet, plate by plate. Each was over 880 feet long and 110 feet high, half again as big as Lusitania. One was called the Olympic, the other, Titanic.
The Titanic and the Olympic were the largest structures in the world. They were larger than any skyscraper in the world at the time, and they moved. So imagine when they launched them. This huge, gigantic, moving object heading towards the water. And I'm sure the engineers were wondering if it would even float when it hit the water.
On April 10, 1912, a young man named Frank Brown paused on a gangway at the White Star Pier in Southampton to take a photograph of an incredible behemoth sitting on the waters of the River Test. Her name matched the impression spectators had of her: Titanic. The photo Brown took shows portholes running down the side of the ship until they disappear below the wharf line. The second-class gangway, over 500 feet away, can barely be seen. As the ship set sail, Brown stayed on deck, snapping pictures. 2 tugboats nudging the liner into the channel. Well-wishers dockside waving goodbye. Minutes later, he took a photo of a narrow escape, the stern of the liner New York, drifting on a collision course after the American vessel snapped her moorings in the suction of Titanic's massive propellers. The 2 ships missed each other by a few feet. Brown was only going as far as Queenstown, Ireland, so he made use of his one day on board, taking photos whenever he could. Short story writer Jacques Futrelle was headed for New York. He wouldn't get there. Neither would T.W. Macaulay, the gym instructor. Marconi operator Jack Phillips would die, while his partner, Harold Bride, survived. Brown also took a picture of the Marconi room where they worked, a ghostly double exposure. At Queenstown, Brown boarded a tender and captured Titanic's massively plated starboard bow, which would be slashed by an iceberg within 3 days. His final photograph showed Titanic sitting in the harbor, waiting to take on her Queenstown passengers. Today, the city of Queenstown is known as Cove. It's still a port city, but ocean liners seldom stop here anymore. Today, the docks that once serviced Lusitania, Mauretania, and Titanic are home to cruise ships and the occasional trawler. The train station that once brought immigrants from all over Ireland on the first leg of their trip to the New World now lies abandoned. But for Bob Ballard, the old port is a very special place.
More than 85 years ago, over 120 Irish immigrants walked out on this dock to get aboard the RMS Titanic shuttle boats. The Titanic itself was out in the channel. This was her last port of call. This is Queenstown, at least that's what it was called back then. It was the last time anyone ever saw the ship until we found her on the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean in 12,000 feet of water.
In the early summer of 1985, a French research vessel made its way slowly across the North Atlantic. On board was a young ocean explorer named Bob Ballard, who had been dreaming of locating Titanic's final resting place for most of his adult life.
I'm a deep sea explorer, and there are only so many Mount Everests in the deep sea, and clearly the Titanic is the quintessential of all sunken ships. If you look at the lost liners, it's the only one that was really still lost. We knew where the Andrea Doria was, we knew where the Britannic was, we knew where the Lusitania was, the Empress of Ireland. Everyone knew where those ships were, but the Titanic was really lost.
To find the site of history's most famous shipwreck, Ballard needed help. So he joined forces with a French oceanographic team led by Jean-Louis Michel. The French possessed a highly prized piece of technology, a sleek red torpedo-shaped sonar system. Ballard expected the French ship would find the Titanic using sonar, then be joined by an American vessel to photograph the wreck. Since there wasn't much interest in Ballard's quest, he had to bring along his own ad hoc film crew to document his discovery if and when it happened. And the skeptics had every reason to believe he would fail. Since no one could be certain exactly where the Titanic was when she hit the iceberg, there were hundreds of square miles to search. But by calculating the position of other ships in the area at that time, Ballard believed he had narrowed Titanic's final resting place to a rough square, 10 miles on a side. Through June and most of July, the French boat crisscrossed the search area and came up empty.
By the time the French expedition was over, we had searched 80% of the search area, but we'd found nothing. And my biggest fear was that it was covered by the 1914 earthquake, and the avalanche had covered the ship, and no one would ever find it. It was unfindable. So when we came back from the expedition, I had to conclude that maybe there's no Titanic to find.
Friday, April 12th, 1912. Titanic's first day on the open sea. In the Marconi room, the two young wireless operators were just getting used to their brand new surroundings. Although Harold Bride was only 21 years old, he had already served a tour of duty on the Lusitania. Jack Phillips, a veteran of many Atlantic crossings, had celebrated his 25th birthday just the day before. Now they sent out a steady stream of messages, mostly from first-class passengers. By Saturday, Titanic's passengers had settled into shipboard routine, a young mother and her parents among them.
My grandfather had tickets on another ship, but he decided to go on the Titanic, and that's what he did. And my mother, for some reason, decided to go with her parents back to Milwaukee, and I was left in London in a boarding home. Now my Mother was a little disturbed because she had left me, but the Titanic was such a beautiful ship and so luxurious that she had a pretty good time on board ship. It was a wonderful time. People dined very well, and in the morning when you got up after you had breakfast, you walked on deck, and around 11 o'clock they used to serve hot bouillon. And of course they served tea in the afternoon, and they had an orchestra that played, and people enjoyed themselves. They played cards, they wrote letters, and the orchestra was lovely to listen to at tea time. It was luxurious.
My mother was a nursemaid to a well-to-do lady, and my father had a pub. And my father decided after a time, after a lot of letters from his relations in Kansas, urging him to go over because there was more opportunity there, that he decided to emigrate. I was the youngest of the family. I was 9 weeks old. My brother was under 2 years old, so it was quite an undertaking. So that is how they were on the Titanic.
For many of the passengers, Titanic was more like a floating city than a ship. It had 4 dining rooms, 2 libraries, a squash court, and a swimming pool. Fully booked, it could carry about 3,500 people, including a crew of just under 1,000. The price of a steerage ticket was $33. The most expensive stateroom cost over 100 times that much, the equivalent of $50,000 today. And for its maiden voyage, Titanic had attracted more than its share of the rich and the famous.
In first class, you were sort of looked to as celebrities. People didn't have movie stars to look to back then, and so you always followed what the well-to-do were doing because they always, were the fashionable. They did the right things and all the fun things, whatever. And so you had some of the biggest names in society, Guggenheims and Astors, and all the big names that everyone recognized. And so those are the kinds of people who took, maiden voyages of the greatest ship in the world. And I know that there were even people in second class who would have traveled first on other liners, but in some cases their agents had told them, well, you might be more comfortable in second class on this ship because these people will be, big names. They'll be incredibly, well known, and you'd probably feel a little inferior.
The Titanic was about 400 miles south of Newfoundland when a series of wireless reports reached the ship's Marconi room, warning of icebergs to the north and west. It was just before noon, Saturday, April 13th, 1912. On the bridge, Captain Edward Smith decided the ice posed no threat to his ship and maintained full speed ahead.
He wanted to be in New York when he was due. A whole schedule was built up for arrival in New York, picking up the maiden voyage eastbound passengers going back, and Titanic was entering service, and Captain Smith, her master, was a senior commodore of the line, due shortly to retire, was a pretty complacent man.
All that afternoon and into the evening, the wireless operators continued to receive warnings from other ships of pack ice dead ahead. But Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, busy with first-class telegram traffic, probably neglected to send all the reports to the bridge.
1912 April was a bad year for ice, and it was further south and in greater quantities than normal, and Smith just barreled on. He didn't stop his ship, and he ignored 6 radioed ice warnings that said clearly there was enormous ice field, and inevitably he ran afoul of the odds.
But the odds were probably not on Captain Smith's mind. The Titanic was, after all, unsinkable.
The White Star Line didn't so much publicize the Titanic as unsinkable, but there was certainly a common knowledge that it was. Amongst the employees, they were telling people that, whether it was in the literature or not. There were several instances where people would comment to one of the crewmen or maybe someone at the White Star Line office in New York or London about, the possibility of an accident, and they would always say, well, the ship is unsinkable.
The seas were calm, visibility was excellent. The 4 days at sea had been utterly tranquil. Too tranquil, some would recall later.
My mother sent home a postcard to my grandmother from Queenstown to say that everything was fine up to now. It sounded really a bit ominous.
There were other portents. The near collision with the American liner at Southampton. The grimy face of a stoker peering over the fourth funnel while the ship was anchored at Queenstown, looking down at the passengers like some grim death's head.
And there were a series of premonitions. I still, on board ships, passengers will come up to me and say, my grandmother or grandfather or my uncle or my priest all came to Southampton, were all ready to board Titanic, and they saw the ship and they had a premonition of disaster and they decided not to sail. Well, my theory is if you put all the premonitions together, they'd stretch end to end from New York to Southampton.
The last meal served in Titanic's first-class dining room featured filet mignon lili, roast squab, and roast duckling with apple sauce. Steerage passengers were served porridge, cold beef, and pickles. The first-class dining room closed sometime after 10. Around the same time, Captain Smith left the bridge and went to his quarters. On seas that were almost glassy, the great ship sailed on. The lookout spotted the iceberg about 15 minutes before midnight. On the bridge, the officer of the watch tried to avoid a collision by turning his ship to port. But it was too late. Titanic scraped the iceberg, leaving 4 long, thin slashes under the waterline. 14 square feet of her hull, less than the size of a door, was now open to the sea.
If he'd rammed it, the bow might have crumpled like tinfoil, but he'd have stayed afloat. But he tried to get around it, and in so doing, you expose the side of the ship to that raking blow of ice.
The irony of the Titanic sinking is that the weather was so good that the Titanic sank. If the weather hadn't been as good, it wouldn't have hit the iceberg at all. Very often what you do is you sight an iceberg by looking for the ring of foam that's breaking against the base by the waves, and there were no waves that night. And so here they had this perfectly calm ocean, and the Titanic, all by itself ran into an iceberg without any help from an outside ship or anything. I mean, that alone was amazing.
In the Marconi room, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride send out their first distress call. They used a new signal that would soon become synonymous with a call for help. 3 dots, 3 dashes, 3 dots. SOS. At about the same time, Captain Smith was receiving his first assessment of the damage. The news couldn't have been worse. Within an hour, 2 at the most, Titanic was going to sink. The nearest rescue ships were over 4 hours away. There weren't enough lifeboats. People were going to die. The only question was, how many?
Imagine, if you will, a family on the Titanic. At 11:40 at night, the children have long been in bed, the parents are about to go to bed. Suddenly there's a long, grating, grinding crash along the side of the ship. The vessel stops. Crewmen are rushing around.
My brother and I were in bed, and suddenly my parents heard a crash. So my father said he would go up on deck to find out what had happened. He went up, came back down and said, apparently the ship has struck an iceberg. Get the children out of bed and on deck as quickly as possible.
And my mother went out into the hall and she met my grandfather. And he said, Harriet, don't worry. the ship is in trouble, but her watertight compartments will hold her up until help comes.
People had this faith in this unsinkable ship, and they'd go up on deck and the stewards would say, well, no, there's nothing that's wrong, go back to bed, whatever. And a lot of people did. They just didn't think anything had happened.
My mother went up to the top deck and she looked at the iceberg, and here was this huge white mountain. And as she turned around, she met one of the officers of the Titanic, and he said, "Go downstairs immediately and put on your life preserver." So my mother went to her cabin, and she was so upset. She said to herself, "I don't know what jewelry to take." So she would pick up her jewelry, different pieces, and throw them down. She did that several times. And she ended up with my baby picture. And that's all she saved. And the clothes that she had on her back.
They thought the ship wouldn't sink, it was unsinkable. But my father didn't take any chances. So he got my mother and we children up on deck and said goodbye to my mother and said, "Hope to see you later."
And suddenly the implication is, as women and children are asked to enter the lifeboats, that the fathers will not go with them. It's a terrifying moment. Terrifying for the wives, particularly for the children. And the fathers tried to make the best of it by saying, we'll be coming on another ship, we'll be coming on a later boat, or we'll join you tomorrow.
And my mother was helped into lifeboat number 13. I was put in a sack because I was so small, and then put into lifeboat number 13. And after my mother was in the lifeboat, she discovered she didn't have Bertram, my brother. So that was another worry for her, but of course she couldn't do anything about it. But luckily, he'd been looked after by one of the other passengers.
In the Marconi room, Phillips and Bride continued to send out distress calls until Smith gave the order to abandon ship. Their last message was sent a little before 2 a.m.
The lifeboat rowed away from the ship, and my mother said they didn't talk very much, but they were bailing water all night, because in the lifeboat there's a big cork, and for some reason or other they didn't have any cork in there. So they had to bail water.
And one of the survivors even wrote years later, how strange it was to be sleeping at one point, on board the greatest ocean liner in the world, and within half an hour she found herself rowing a lifeboat staring back at this ocean liner, and it was sinking.
My mother said that when the ship went down, it went down this way, bow first. And she said the cries were just horrible, just horrible. And then after the ship went down, the silence was ghastly. Now those were her words. She said it was ghastly, it was so silent.
One lady I knew actually said that she wouldn't get into a lifeboat. It was one thing she always made sure that people knew when she told about the Titanic, was that people wouldn't get in the lifeboats, and just how awful that was. And of course the other thing that she always made sure people were aware of, because it is a fascinating story, and people, love the Titanic and they love to hear about it, but she always made sure that everybody knew how awful the screams of the dying were, because when the ship finally went down and all these people were freezing to death in the water and there was no help coming for them, and she just said it was horrible. And for her, and really for many of the survivors, it never left her. It was never out of her ears. To the day she died, she could always hear those screams.
And what happened to your father?
Well, he drowned. And I don't think the body's ever been found. I haven't heard. Some of them were found, but I've never heard that he was found. And that is why I will never see the film. Because if I saw it, I would wonder what happened to him. Then we stayed in a hospital for 2 or 3 weeks for my mother to recover a little bit. And then we came back to England because we had nothing. We had no clothes, we had no money, and of course she was so broken-hearted she just wanted to get home.
When Titanic sank, when newsboys on Broadway were shouting the news, they didn't know much about it. They just knew the ship had struck an iceberg and gone to the bottom. Women coming out of the theaters on Broadway fainted. Not women who had family or friends on board. They swooned just from shock. And this was the disbelief that attended this event.
We learned from the Titanic, unsinkable ships do sink. We learned that you can't become too complacent. You can't get too arrogant about certain things. It may very well have been the age of innocence that ended that night. One lady wrote afterwards that all the things that seemed so important before the Titanic didn't matter anymore.
I think Titanic does, in a sense, serve as a benchmark, as a time that people stop taking things for granted. I think I equate it with the explosion of the Challenger in our own time, when we were all watching that rocket going up into orbit, and suddenly, before our eyes, it exploded, this inexplicable, massive failure of technology right in front of us. This is the impact the Titanic had.
The last week of August, 1985. Ballard and Jean-Louis Michel were back in the search area for the second time that summer, this time on the American ship Nor. And this time using a camera sled called Argo instead of sonar to search the bottom.
My strategy was completely different than Jean-Louis'. He was looking for the Titanic. I wasn't looking for the Titanic. I was looking for its debris.
Eyewitness accounts seem to suggest that Titanic had split in half just before going under. That meant that everything from dining tables to engine room equipment might have spilled out in its long plunge to the sea floor. It was on this telltale debris trail that Ballard was pinning his hopes and aiming his cameras.
That area of the ocean has millions and millions of rocks, from pebbles to houses, and that would confuse your sonar. But your eye can tell the difference between a boulder and a boiler.
By the end of August, Ballard had retraced most of the area the French had surveyed earlier, with similar results.
I was starting to realize we were going to fail, just as we'd done on the French expedition. And I knew what an awful feeling that was, and for everybody, it was like going to a funeral.
By midnight on August 31st, the Nor had surveyed every bit of the 100 square miles where Titanic must have gone down, except for one tiny sliver at the northernmost point.
Jean-Louis Michel was the watch leader for that watch. So at 2 in the morning, just as he's about to get to where he had done his search, they pick up a debris trail. Nothing definitive, but they're the first debris trail we've seen. And just bam, 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 as fast as I could, I got down to the control van, came blowing into the control van just as they were going over the boiler. And the place exploded. Everyone was just excited, exploding. And we were celebrating. I mean, we went from this agony of defeat to the joy of success. And then someone made this innocent comment, gee, the Titanic sinks in 20 minutes. And it was just devastating comment because we were dancing on someone's grave. And I was deeply moved. Deeply moved.
The discovery of Titanic created a sensation and an insatiable appetite for artifacts. Since Ballard never claimed ownership, others were free to strip her bare. And they did.
Finding the Titanic has been good news and bad news. I mean, it's changed my life tremendously, mostly for the good. I guess I was just naive to think that people would leave it alone. I mean, these ships they'll never be the pretty young ladies they once were. They're just old corpses in many ways, but it's like when you bury your grandma, you put a necklace on her and give her some earrings or something, and it sort of gives some dignity to the old lady in her grave. And I look at the ornaments on the ship as her jewelry. And I just think that she deserves that.
With the sinking of the Titanic, an age of innocence began to end. It turned out we weren't able to master nature after all. Bigger didn't always mean better. The world was changing. Life was becoming more modern and more dangerous. 5 years after he found the Titanic, Ballard decided to explore the wreck of another tragedy at sea. But this one wasn't an accident. It was an act of war. And if the loss of Titanic signaled the waning of an age of innocence, what happened on the Irish Sea in the spring of 1915 launched an age of despair. This time, the victim was the Cunard liner that had revolutionized ocean travel, the ship known as the Greyhound of the Seas, Lusitania. For 8 years, Lusitania had journeyed across the seas of a changing world without so much as a hint of trouble. According to the rules of war, a ship carrying civilians was off limits. But the rules of war were changing. In Europe, the first war to employ modern weapons was creating a battlefield of unprecedented carnage. New supplies of bombs and bullets were needed daily on the Western Front, and some of them came from America. Officially, the United States was neutral. Privately, it turned its back when war material from American factories found its way aboard British vessels, including passenger ships. Few people knew it at the time, but as the Lusitania prepared to leave New York in May of 1915, she was carrying bullets and shrapnel fuses in one of her forward cargo holds. She also carried 1,959 passengers, most of them women and children. Lusitania sailed from New York on a Saturday, bound for Liverpool. She had made over 200 trips across the ocean since recapturing the Blue Ribbon 8 years earlier. This journey would be her last. The North Atlantic has always been a dangerous ocean, but in the spring of 1915, there was more for seagoers to fear in the water than icebergs or violent storms. It lived underwater, a new kind of war machine, the U-boat, that carried a new kind of weapon, the torpedo. The war in Europe had become a war of attrition. England needed supplies, and they had to come by ship. German U-boat captains had standing orders to sink any vessel that might be carrying war supplies. That usually meant tankers or cargo ships, but not always. On the morning Lusitania set sail, a notice appeared in a New York newspaper, a warning in small type, which attracted little attention.
Passengers leaving America then departing for England were assured immunity from Germany if they took passage on the American liners. But American liners were slower then. The Lusitania was the ocean queen, the greyhound of the seas, and there was a magnetic attraction about its high speed and the opulence of the ship and the surroundings, and there was also a feeling of more excitement. If we travel on the Cunard vessel, we'll get some hint of the war. We may see a submarine, we may see a mine explode or a torpedo. Of course it won't happen to us, but that would be a more exciting voyage. There was that sense of bravado prevailing.
My father did book tickets on the Titanic, but I think as my mother was pregnant by her first child, they probably thought better of her and said, we won't go, we'll wait for the Lusitania. We were very close to United Family. We were if we'd all survived, we would have been 7 full families. We were educated in England, but we always travelled first class and loved travelling. It was such fun to go by sea anyway. It was wonderful, the life, the board ship life was absolutely marvellous. Wonderful.
It was a beautiful ship. There was a lot of children on board, a lot of them babies, some around my age, some older. It's a shame. Not quite 3 years old. It was a month before my birthday. It happened in May, and my birthday's in June. It was just my mother and I. My dad stayed in the States. She wanted to go home to see her mother. And naturally, she took me with her. She wasn't going to leave me behind. And so that's why we went. But Dad, he was working, he couldn't go, and so he stayed here. She was very sweet person. You can tell just by looking at her face.
After an uneventful crossing that took her 6 days, Lusitania reached the coast of Ireland. The seas were calm. The weather was clear with patches of fog. It was a little before 2 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. In the first-class restaurant, lunch was still being served.
And those who finished lunch came out on deck then to lean over the rail to see if they could get any glimpse of this First World War they had been hearing about. And some looked out for submarines or objects in the water. One even expressed a wish that, a young lady expressed a wish to her father. She said, I hope we will get some thrill before we reach Liverpool. Meaning some incident in war, some wartime incident. And she was not disappointed.
none of the passengers would have been aware that about 13 miles away, a U-boat on her way back to Germany was watching Lusitania through her periscope.
As it rounded the corner on the southeast coast of Ireland near the old head of Kinsale, the area was covered in fog. The captain had to close on land. He had to actually leave the channel and head in to get a bearing. And ironically, at that time, the submarine was beyond range. You could see the ship, but it was too far away to fire at it.
At 1:40 p.m., Captain Turner made a 30-degree turn to starboard, a maneuver that would bring him directly into the submarine's line of fire. Aboard the U-boat, Captain Walter Schwieger couldn't quite believe his luck.
It's interesting to guess what might be on his mind. Firstly, he would have known that had he surfaced and given a fair warning, there was every reason that he would be rammed by Captain Turner, who had received hostile orders in 1915 that if he sighted submarines, he was to charge forward and ram them with his sharp prow. And if he sank one, then he would get a handsome cash reward of £1,000. So those thoughts must have gone through Schweiger's mind. And he would also have very good reason to know that he was torpedoing a ship, carrying munitions to slaughter his fellow countrymen.
Schwieger had only one small torpedo left, not powerful enough to do much damage to such a large ship. Nonetheless, when the liner had closed to 700 yards, he launched it. It was a few minutes past 2 o'clock. On the bluffs above the Irish Sea, the Henderson family was having a picnic.
May the 7th, as far as I was concerned, as a small boy, it was just an ordinary day. We went down for a picnic onto our favourite spot, which was Kinsale, beautiful harbour in Southern Ireland. Glorious afternoon, sun shining, sea calm, a nice bluish grey scene. And my father suddenly pointed out a big ship coming round what was Courtmacsherry Bay, the point of Courtmacsherry Bay, into view. I'd never seen as big a ship as this before. 4 massive funnels, 3 of them smoking away merrily, and we were fascinated as this ship came more or less towards us as she came up the channel. And she was, just about opposite us when there was a terrific explosion.
We were having lunch, at the end of the lunch period, and I was standing at the table with a spoon in my hand.
When my mother was on deck, and standing with somebody who was, I think, smoking cigars, he said, "You see that? It's a torpedo." And that was it.
It just jerked the boat. So everybody was scared. We walked from the dining area straight out onto the deck. If we'd been lowered down, we wouldn't have been able to get up.
We didn't know what had happened, but even on the land, it appeared that the ship shuddered. And very quickly afterwards, there was a second explosion.
After the torpedo strike then, of course, within a minute, the second mystery explosion occurred in the forward part of the ship. And the effect of that was to cause a power failure. So the ship was now blacked out below decks.
Almost immediately, the ship began to list to starboard. Cold water rushed into the boiler rooms, and the ship lost power. The first-class elevator stopped between floors, trapping everyone inside. Below deck, passengers trying to make their way to the lifeboats were plunged into darkness. Those who did make it topside found chaos, lifeboats careening down the decks or capsizing when they hit the water. 15 minutes after the explosion, Lusitania's decks were underwater. 3 minutes later, she was gone.
I was told that my mother jumped overboard. I have been told that I was saved by a purser who picked me up in his arms and jumped overboard with me in his arms into the lifeboat, the last lifeboat, because the ship was about ready to go down.
And very gradually, the bows went down, and as the bows went down, the stern came up, until the propellers were out of the water, and she was quite clear of the water. And at an angle, I would think, of about 45 degrees, she sat poised, and then as if just on the slide, she slowly slid down, quite dramatically, below the waves. The sea was boiling, and the liner disappeared.
Behind her, Lusitania left a trail of debris, bodies, and survivors that stretched for several miles. Only 8 of her 48 lifeboats had made it into the water safely. The first rescue vessels arrived over 2 hours after the liner had disappeared. Most of those people who hadn't made it into a lifeboat had already perished from the cold. News of what had happened spread quickly. So did the sense of outrage.
The world was appalled and shocked to learn that 1,200 civilian lives had been slaughtered. And they were especially shocked to read accounts then of the dazed and shivering survivors limping ashore at Queenstown late that evening. And many of those survivors had appalling injuries from the explosions on the ship, and many died within 4 or 5 hours of being landed ashore at Queenstown. And the world was also shocked to hear tales then of lines of boats that followed in the rescued, bringing in a grim cargo of dead plucked from the Atlantic. And these dripping bodies were laid out on the walls and piers of Queenstown.
My mother said it was one of the most awful decisions she had to make, because we were in Ireland for some time at Queenstown, Coburn, and she was there waiting for 3 months, because waiting to see if my sisters, would turn up, which of course they didn't.
It was a horrifying business, about 1,100 or 1,200 people killed, largely Americans, and it was popularly supposed to have brought America into the war. But in fact, America didn't enter the war for 2 more years. But more than bring America into the war or serve as outrage, it really served as an indication to Cunard and to the British and to the Americans and the French, to all the Allies, that total war meant civilians as well as servicemen. And so that single torpedo that was fired at the Lusitania in May 7th, 1915, served as a wonderful ending to a period of curiously myopic innocence.
Well, if you look at all the lost liners, I think the Lusitania is the most tragic. The Lusitania was a tragic act of war. I mean, the captain of the German U-boat knew what he was firing at. He knew it was a luxury liner with women and children and elderly people aboard. It was an act of aggression, a wanton act of war.
But how could one small torpedo sink such a large, well-armored ship? In 1993, Ballard went looking for the answer. If the Lusitania had been carrying contraband explosives that caused the second explosion, then some of the blame belonged to Great Britain.
Well, there's a lot of controversy around the second explosion. Everyone knows that there was 2 explosions. The Germans say they only fired 1 torpedo, and all the evidence suggests that's all that happened. They fired 1 torpedo, and that was the blast everyone heard initially. But followed moments later was this much stronger secondary blast. And all sorts of theories have evolved over what caused that. Some say it was war material that was stored aboard the ship, and we do know that the Lusitania was carrying war material. But the Cunard Line claims that it was non-explosive war material.
Using an ROV named Jason, Ballard mapped most of Lusitania's exposed hull. and was able to determine that the magazine where the explosives were stored was still intact, a finding that seemed to exonerate Great Britain.
So clearly, whatever was in the magazine, war material or not, did not explode. So that leads us to other theories. Some people say that just back of the magazine there was gun cotton stored. We have no evidence whatsoever that there was gun cotton aboard. And so I don't know about that one. There's absolutely no evidence supporting that. We have other people suggesting that there was a fine-grained aluminum dust aboard, and that caused an explosion. We have no evidence to support that. When we were out there, the only evidence we could find to support a theory other than the magazine exploding, which we know it didn't, was that there was a coal dust explosion. Yet, there's no record of any coal dust explosion occurring during World War I on any other ship, so we're still left with this mystery.
We'll probably never know what happened aboard Lusitania in the moments after the torpedo struck. We do know what happened when she sank. Nearly 1,200 people lost their lives, including 100 children.
It was something that would stick in my mind, as it has done, for the rest of my life. And although time fades and the little grey cells get worn out, I can still sit here now and see that liner just sliding beneath the waves.
Midsummer near the mouth of the St. Lawrence River. Only a few miles from the site of a tragedy at sea that rivaled Titanic and Lusitania for loss of life. At the turn of the last century, a ship called the Empress of Ireland passed the small hamlet of Rimouski on its way to the Atlantic Ocean. She never made it. Yet few people have heard the story of what sent her to the bottom in 14 terrifying minutes. For Bob Ballard, what happened to the Empress on the night of May 28, 1914, and what's happened to her since, is a story worth telling.
Well, what brings me here now is to visit the Empress of Ireland, to go beneath the sea with a team of divers and explore the Empress. See her for the first time. I've never seen her before. And I really just wanted to complete that final phase, that final missing liner, and make sure that people realize that the ship's still here and there's still a lot to explore and understand and to protect.
With Ballard is David Creighton, whose grandparents were aboard the Empress when she sank.
There's so much to learn from a shipwreck. It's not just a kind of spectacle, a horror story. There's more to it than that. There are lives that were radically changed. David and Bertha Creighton were images in a photograph. Every Creighton home had that photograph on their piano. And the children would see this picture of old people and they'd ask, who are those people? And then they would learn about a ship called the Empress of Ireland. I went through that experience like all my cousins, and as I've got older, they mean an enormous amount to me.
The river is beginning to widen here, But land is still in sight as Ballard and his team approach the place where the Empress went down.
We came out of Rimouski, out past the sea buoy, then took a bearing of 035, 8.2 miles to the side of the wreck, which is right there. The distance from actually where it sank to shore is less than 5 miles, but no one could have made that. The currents are too strong and the temperature is freezing, so they would freeze to death.
Ballard's first glimpse of the Empress comes as an image on the sonar scan. Ballard has come here with a trio of Canadian divers who have spent years underwater exploring the wreck.
So I think the first thing is to sort of give a good reconnaissance from bow to stern.
They'll show the team's underwater cameraman, Bob Cranston, the ropes.
Photograph that part of the ship that's
Philippe Baudry has been diving on the Empress since 1965. Mark Reynolds joined him in '82. Mark Stanfield will provide technical support.
What is the most dangerous part of the ship? I mean, obviously deep penetrations, but
it is possible as you're swimming along, if you're not being very careful, you can swim into an overhead environment without realizing it. And then as you raise up, expecting to find water above you, you find that you actually have swum in underneath the deck.
Right. Now, when we were working on the Titanic, we tended to always use this upturned hull as our highway, and then we would penetrate in, come back to the highway, go along, penetrate in, come back. I mean, that's just how I've always worked these big ships.
If you start here, can you end up on the bow, or do you have to re-anchor the boat to go to the bow?
Yeah, that's a fair swim, but it's...
I mean, I've never dove on a 600-foot ship before.
It moves fast. You'd be surprised. It's a couple times down a football field, 2 football fields. Now, I understand there are actual human remains aboard the ship. Now, where are they located?
Well, one of the areas that there's the greatest concentration of them is in the steward's quarters. Whether or not we'll see any when we're diving is
hard to say.
Very difficult to say. The silt inside shifts from week to week, and sometimes they're exposed, sometimes they're covered back up by the silt.
I think we just want to personalize the ship and let people understand. I mean, the thing that's so amazing about the Empress of Ireland is most people never heard of it. I mean, it had more passengers died on the Empress of Ireland than on the Titanic, and yet you ask the average person who the Empress of Ireland, she says, I don't know, who is she? And they think of it, it's some human being, as opposed to Canada's greatest maritime disaster.
Among the passengers aboard the Empress was a middle-aged couple from Ontario.
This was a very special trip for David and Bertha Creighton to be able to go together to England. To the best of our knowledge, she'd never left the Canadian shores. So it was keenly anticipated. They were going to the Salvation Army International Congress in London. My grandmother, Bertha Creighton, was married at quite a young age. She raised 5 children, and she raised children with a great deal of humor and tenderness and strength. And we see this in herself only in one letter that has survived. And it was written on the train from Toronto to Quebec City. And as the train moves along, she describes things seen out the window, some chickens, some people coming on in the province of Quebec, and we're speaking French.
The trip from Toronto took about 8 hours aboard a Canadian Pacific train. Then they would board a Canadian Pacific ship, which carried passengers back and forth from the interior of the North American continent. It was one of the company's selling points that someone could travel from Tokyo to Liverpool and never have to leave a Canadian Pacific conveyance. In the early afternoon of May 28th, the Creightons arrived in Quebec City and went directly to their ship. She was a large two-funneled vessel called the Empress of Ireland. Along with her sister ship, the Empress of Britain, she was the pride of the Canadian Pacific Fleet, a seasoned veteran that had crossed the ocean nearly 200 times.
She was a fairly typical ship of her time, that is to say, of about the turn of the century. She was built in 1904, and she was a big transatlantic liner by the standards of most of the ships of those days. She had an enormous crew who were largely concerned with the engine room. She had over 130 people working on her engines, putting coal in the boilers and generally keeping the ship moving.
On this voyage, 1,057 passengers were listed on the manifest. First and second class were modestly booked. Third class, as usual, was nearly sold out.
And we must remember that the immigrant trade, which we think of as being all one way, was in fact not. People used to go to the States and they would work there for a while and then they would come back, bringing their money with them. And in the case of the Empress of Ireland, she was carrying a large number of people who'd been working in the States at the Ford company in Detroit. And when Ford took one of their cars out of production, all those people went back to Ireland or Russia or wherever they'd come from.
At 4:30 in the afternoon, the Empress of Ireland set sail. Below deck, people got their first glimpse of their new accommodations.
They would be taken down to their quarters below deck and lodged probably in 6 or 8 or 10 berth cabins. So if they were a large family, and they frequently were, they would have a cabin to themselves. If not, they would almost certainly share a cabin with several other people. It was better than dormitory class accommodation, but not very much better.
The Creightons, traveling second class, had their own cabin. It had bunk beds, a nightstand, a sink, a writing table. The first night aboard a ship was traditionally more casual than the rest, and the Creightons probably ate dinner, their last meal, around 7 o'clock. A veteran traveler like David would have consoled his wife that seasickness wouldn't be a problem until they reached the Atlantic. Until then, they'd be on the St. Lawrence River, where the seas were always calm and land was never very far away. And if thoughts of the Titanic disaster 2 years earlier crossed anyone's mind, passengers were assured that the Empress had more than enough lifeboats and a well-trained crew to man them. So there really wasn't anything to worry about, except perhaps getting a good night's sleep. There would be plenty of time to explore the ship in the morning. On the first day of exploration, Ballard's command boat is anchored into position just above the Empress. A buoy warns divers that the Empress is protected by the Canadian government. No artifacts may be removed. One of the men responsible for the ship's protected status is Philippe Baudry. Baudry spent 30 years of his life diving on the Empress of Ireland, taking whatever he could find. Then he had a change of heart and began an intense lobbying effort to protect what remained.
I think Philip Baudry's change of philosophy is reflective of this change on the part of society. If he can see the light, then a lot of people should see the light.
The kind of voice, that I heard, almost from heaven, from God, whatever, and I felt, I had a mission, to protect it. Why? I really don't know why, because that way you had no reason.
Someone had to, and you became the someone.
Yep.
Now, how long ago did Canada pass laws to protect the ship?
Only a year ago.
So only recently?
Yep, very recently.
Because the Empress lies in less than 200 feet of water, it was possible to dive on it just after it sank, using the primitive technology of the times. Those early divers blasted a hole in her hull to recover some silver bars she was carrying, as well as the mail. Then she sat there, untouched and forgotten, for half a century. In 1965, Philippe Baudry made his first descent on the wreck, and others soon followed. In those days, every part of the ship was considered fair game for salvagers. Philippe Baudry himself took so many artifacts from the Empress he was able to start a small museum. Mark Reynolds was another diver who took things from the wreck, and then, like Baudry, began to see his actions in a different light.
I didn't think that the removal of a plate or a cup had any impact on the wreck itself. And through the course of diving over that many years, I came to realize really that it's really not a commodity. Right. It is a piece of history, and everything that's removed from it diminishes it.
May 28th, 1914, a little past 9 in the evening. The Empress was now about 90 miles out of port. Dinner had been served, and throughout the ship, stewards were preparing the stateroom and cabins. Parents spent the last few moments with their children before sending them off to bed. A few hands of cards were underway in the first-class smoking room. In the second-class lounge, the Salvation Army Band gave an impromptu concert. And in his cabin, David Creighton wrote a quick letter to his family.
RMS, Empress of Ireland, May 28, 1914. My dear son, bless you and Edith and Willie and Arthur and Cyrus, and give us in due time the pleasure of meeting again with good news and all well. Enclosed is the note and will which you will have placed in that little ledger book. I do believe you will all honestly strive to be helpful to each other and do your best during our absence. It was really brave of you all. We will have a good budget of news to mail you when we land at Liverpool. Our very best affection and love for all. Let the others read this letter. Papa and Mama.
Around 1:30 a.m., the Empress passed the town of Rimouski. 2 miles downriver, she dropped off her pilot and the mail pouch. In it was David Creighton's letter. The Empress was now in the hands of her captain, George Kendall. Kendall was 39 years old and had years of experience. But this was only his second transatlantic crossing with the Empress, and the first time he'd taken her down the St. Lawrence. The Empress was now 200 miles out of port. Most of the passengers had gone to bed. And on the bridge of the Empress, the first officer noticed the masthead lights of a ship approaching upriver. He reckoned it to be about 8 miles away and closing slowly on his starboard side.
our first dive, we'd like to go to the bow, see the capstan, see the winches, see maybe the main mast which is broken, and that's would be it. We maybe go, to the crew quarter because it's an easy place to go in. But for the first dive, I feel like, according to our safety factors, we don't want to go any further.
Give Bob a first look. Can we go over the top of the bow where that anchor is? Put the light on, put some lights on that anchor, and then kind of go up over the side of the bow and kind of reveal that foredeck a little bit. That's cool. Yeah. Let's go in the water. The beautiful.
One more excuse.
Yeah, no, it's good. No, it's gorgeous. Let's jump in the water and take advantage of it. Okay. I'm getting warm here, so let's go. All right, let's go.
Even in midsummer, the water in the St. Lawrence River is cold, just a few degrees above freezing. So the divers want to cover every bit of exposed skin they can.
Okay.
The Empress lies at a depth that's about the equivalent of a 10-story building. So unlike Titanic and Lusitania, this ship is easily accessible to divers.
You want to go out? I've never looked at one of these liners the same way. Each time it's been different. When I found the Titanic, it was with undersea robots, but then I actually got in a submarine, closed the hatch, and went down and visited the Titanic on the ocean floor. When I went to the Lusitania, it was a combination of robots and a submarine. Here we're using divers, and divers are carrying down camera systems, and I'm hooked up from the surface. I'm actually able to talk with the divers and direct them as we penetrate into the ship and go and explore its exterior. So again, another way of doing it. I've never done it this way.
A 300-foot length of coaxial cable connects the camera to monitors in the control room on board the ship. In just a few minutes, Ballard will get his first look at the Empress. And David Creighton will see something he's wondered about all his life. Images from his grandparents' grave. In these same waters, nearly 100 years ago, the captain of the Empress stood with his first mate, watching the lights of an oncoming ship. It was now about 2 miles away. Captain Kendall was preparing to make a routine right-side to right-side pass when he and the other officers on the bridge thought they saw something unusual, a sign that the approaching ship was changing course.
The officer of the watch at the store stand made, I think, an understandable but mistaken decision that the Empress was on his left-hand side, and he ordered the ship to be put over to the right. But the Empress wasn't on her left-hand side. She was on her right-hand side.
At almost the same moment, Kendall noticed a dense bank of fog rolling onto the river from the shore.
But wherever you get two ships, or even one ship, meets with disaster, you nearly always find this inexplicable element of sheer bad luck. And I think that is true particularly of the Empress of Ireland.
Within moments, both ships were lost in the fog. Kendall cut his engines and signaled with his foghorn that he was doing so. Then he waited, uneasily.
On board the Empress, the officers of the watch were looking out, watching for the ship, which they knew was somewhere close to them. What they didn't expect to see was what they were horrified to see, which was the Norwegian collier coming straight towards them through the fog.
For about 10 seconds, Kendall watched helplessly as the unknown vessel bore down on him, knowing that a collision was inevitable.
and she hit the liner at the ship's most vulnerable point, which was the bulkhead between the two engine rooms. And she just cut her open, as somebody said, like a can opener.
On board the Empress, all anyone noticed was a gentle shudder. Within 30 seconds of the collision, the ship's wireless officer sent out an SOS, but was told the nearest rescue vessels were at least a half-hour away. For a long moment, the Storstad stayed lodged in the gas she had created. Then she broke free and was lost almost instantly in the fog. Water began pouring into the ship at the rate of 60,000 gallons a second, much of it directly into third and second class cabins. Within a minute of the collision, the liner's boiler rooms were flooded and the electrical power failed. Below decks, over 1,000 passengers were trapped in a ship they barely knew, in the dark.
So far as the passengers in the third class accommodation were concerned, I'm afraid it's a very short story because most of them were drowned in their bunks. A wall of water came through the hole which had been made by the Norwegians, and they had no chance of getting out. Most of the survivors were from cabins higher up in the ship, or they were the crew who had been on duty and were able to escape because they were up and dressed and alert at that time.
10 minutes after the ramming, the Empress was on her side, her funnels touching the water. A few dozen passengers and crew stood on the hull as the ship sank, then simply stepped into the sea when she submerged. It all happened in the space of 14 minutes.
The water was extremely cold, and people were not dressed for it, they were not equipped for it, they were not trained for it. And even if they had been able to swim, I think the shock of the cold water would have killed them almost immediately. I think most people died very quickly, which is perhaps one of the mercies of the whole terrible incident.
Meanwhile, the Storstad lowered her own lifeboats and moved slowly back through the thick fog to see what had happened. There was no sign of a ship, but they knew where to go by the sound of the cries. In the fog, the first survivors began to appear. Visibility was so bad that people only a few feet from the lifeboats couldn't be seen. Most of them were still dressed in their night clothes. The Storstad's lifeboats made their first trip back to the collier packed with survivors, including Captain Kendall. On the second trip, only a few of those they found in the water were still alive. On the third trip, they began picking up bodies. Of the ship's complement of 1,477 passengers and crew, only 357 survived, including 4 children and 11 members of the Salvation Army Band. David and Bertha Creighton were not among them.
Towards the anchor line. We're letting out more tether, Bob. We're letting out more tether. Well, it's very much like the Lusitania. It's just just the feel of it. It's a shallow water wreck, so you have a lot of growth on it. It's not that pristine surface like you get on the Titanic or even on the Britannic. It's heavily encrusted because it's shallow. It's a rich nutrient water up this high, and we're 48 degrees north. So you get a lot of growth, and that gives you limited visibility, and everything's encrusted.
This is something that the family is not completely sure of, but there's a notion that they were in a stateroom quite close to the area of collision.
Where the collision took place.
And if so, it would mean an especially horrendous death. And then, of course,
at least quick.
It would be quick. It's hard to come to terms with it. A sense of loss, of disorientation almost. Sometimes those shots almost gives an ethereal effect.
Okay, you're at the winches at the base of the mast, so you look like you're amidship. Oh, every time you come to one of these ships, it's really a mixture of feelings, but certainly sadness is a big part of it all, because so many people's dreams ended here. And that's sad. I mean, people began these journeys with great expectations, in many cases hoping to start a new life, and instead of starting a new life, they ended their lives. And so when you come here, that's an overriding feeling you have, is that this is a very sad place. And then the fact that the ships are no longer pretty. In fact, they've become corpses, and in many cases very unattractive corpses. That adds to that sense of sadness, and adds, in some ways, a level of macabreness to it all, yeah. It's sloping up to the right. That long railing, I think, may have been this railing at the bridge. Transverse? Yeah, because that's the only one that would be plunging down, would be a transverse. So they must be down here at the masts and down in this neck of the woods.
The Empress of Ireland sank in 14 minutes. David and Bertha Creighton perished in some way, we know not how, and their bodies were never recovered. So at this time, these two feelings are in conflict. I feel so excited to be with people that are interested in the Empress of Ireland. And the horror of it is really starting to come through.
anchor, so they are amidship. That's our line. Looks like they're heading back up. Now, what's the most memorable? You close your eyes and you go, you must have countless times closed your eyes and gone back into the ship. Where does your memory take you?
Sometimes they're finding some what otherwise might seem an insignificant kind of artifact inside the ship. For example, there was a small set of children's doll furniture. And at first I thought, well, isn't it wonderful that this piece has been preserved over the years and hasn't deteriorated? And then you start to think of the connection. It's not just a set of doll furniture. It was something that a father likely bought on his travels, with the expectation of taking it back to, joyful little squeals from his daughter.
Right.
And then the tragedy starts to seep back in. It invades the whole diving experience here.
Coming to this spot and thinking about the Empress of Ireland, there's something religious about it. I feel I'm doing homage to people whom I deeply respect. I feel I have a chance to think more deeply about what a family connection is, what an individual can do in the space of a lifetime. I feel that they made a huge contribution in their limited span of life. I'd like to do the same. If I were able to say anything to my grandparents at this time, I'd say, job well done. May you rest in peace. God bless you.
Leaving the side of the Empress was, for me, fulfilling. The Empress was my final lost liner and did end 15-year journey of exploring the great lost liners. These ships are no longer lost. They're found. And we will deal with them forever. They will never leave our consciousness.
Time had stopped, some say cold dead, a frozen mist played round my head. I looked out on seas of glass, a deadly calm, like days that had passed. Without a sound, I put a flower on the sea, and I prayed a little that you could see me. I fell